A millionaire CEO told his wife, "I don't want to know you." 5 years later, he wept when he saw her with their three daughters. Jason White had built his life around the idea that nothing mattered more than achievement. Every morning he woke up before the sun, dressed in the same perfectly tailored blue suit, and checked his calendar with the same cold focus that had made him a millionaire before he was 30. People in his company admired him, feared him, and never questioned his decisions. He liked it that way. Control was his only measure of success, and he refused to let sentimentality slow him down. Even at home, where he returned late every night, the walls were as clean and impersonal as the conference rooms where he spent his days. The only softness that remained in his life was Ada, and sometimes he thought he resented her for it more than he loved her. She would wait up for him in the living room, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, her blue eyes tired but hopeful. He almost never met that hope with anything but annoyance. One evening she stood up as soon as he came in, holding something in her hands. He could tell she was nervous. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic when she said she had something to tell him. He didn't sit down. He didn't put down his briefcase. He just waited, already bracing himself for another conversation he didn't have time for. When she said she was pregnant, he didn't feel what she obviously expected him to feel. No surge of tenderness or anticipation, only a dull shock that someone else had made a choice without asking his permission. For a moment they looked at each other in complete silence. He saw her smile falter, saw her eyes fill with questions he knew he didn't want to answer. Before she could speak again, he shook his head. His voice was flat and cold when he said the words that would stay with them both forever. "I don't want to know you." He didn't shout, didn't even sound angry. That, he would realize much later, was the part that hurt her the most. He said it as if she were a problem he could cross off his list. She didn't cry. She just stood there holding her stomach, her lips parted as if she were trying to breathe through a pain she hadn't prepared for. He turned away, telling himself it was the right decision. He convinced himself she would be better off without him, that she was too soft for the life he intended to lead. That night, he slept in the guest room, telling himself he needed distance to think clearly. He never noticed when she finally went to bed or how she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her hand resting protectively over the tiny life he had already rejected. In the morning, she was gone. Ada left before dawn without a single word spoken between them. She didn't take much. Just one suitcase, the small amount of money she had in her own account, and the quiet, unsteady hope that somewhere far from Jason she might be able to start again. As the train carried her away from the city, she kept a hand pressed to her belly, feeling the steady flutter of the tiny heartbeat inside her. She told herself she would not cry anymore for a man who could look at her and speak those words as if she were nothing. But when she closed her eyes, she still saw the way he had turned his back without hesitation. She rented a small apartment in a quieter town 2 hours away. The building was old and smelled faintly of damp concrete, but the landlord was kind and didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. She bought a second-hand crib from a woman down the street who had also been left alone. That woman pressed a paper bag of baby clothes into her hands and said she would pray for her. Ada thanked her and went home to unpack in silence. She tried not to look at the space beside her bed where she had imagined Jason would someday put his hand on her stomach and feel their child kick. The first months were a blur of nausea and fear. She found part-time work at a bakery, baking through the night so she could rest during the day when her body felt heavy with exhaustion. Each morning, she would touch her swelling belly and whisper that everything would be okay, even when she wasn't sure she believed it herself. She didn't call Jason. She never expected him to come looking for her. The only thing she allowed herself to hope for was that someday she would feel strong again. When the girls came into the world, the hospital staff stared. 3 identical babies, each one a perfect echo of the others, all with the same blonde hair that was not hers, and the same clear blue eyes that would always remind her of him. She held them in her arms and cried because she knew that no matter how far she had run, she would never truly be free of Jason White. But she also felt something stronger than regret. She felt the fierce certainty that they deserved more than his rejection, more than her sadness. She named them Lily, Cameron, and Bella, names she had chosen in the quiet hours when she lay awake and tried to imagine what kind of future she could give them. In the years that followed, Ada learned how to be everything on her own. She learned how to stretch a paycheck to cover rent and baby formula. She learned how to carry all three girls up the stairs when they were too tired to walk. She learned how to hold her head up in the grocery store when strangers asked where her husband was. At night, when she tucked them into bed, she would sometimes feel a hollow ache in her chest and wonder if she had made the right decision to leave without ever giving him the chance to change his mind. But then one of the girls would sigh in her sleep and reach for her hand, and Ada would close her eyes and know she had done what she had to do. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his money. She just needed to keep loving them enough for both of their parents. And she did. 3 years passed in a rhythm of small routines that had nothing to do with Jason's world anymore. Ada rose before dawn to pack 3 lunchboxes with careful sameness, tying each little blonde ponytail with matching ribbons, brushing crumbs off tiny yellow dresses that never stayed clean for more than an hour. She walked them to preschool every morning, one child holding each hand and the third skipping just ahead, never quite in step. Sometimes Ada thought that story followed her like a shadow she could never step out of, but most days she simply didn't have time to care. She was too busy making sure her daughters felt safe and loved and never doubted for a second that they were wanted. At night, when the girls were finally asleep, she sat on the edge of the narrow sofa and closed her eyes against the hum of the old refrigerator and the weariness that crept into her bones. She rarely let herself think about Jason anymore. What was the point? He was probably sitting in some high-rise office overlooking the city skyline, convinced he had been right to send her away. Maybe he had convinced himself she had never been important, that the children were better off without him. In her darker moments, she almost wished she could hate him enough to forget him completely. But then, she would hear a sleepy voice calling Mama, and the sharp edge of that bitterness would soften into something sadder and heavier. She never told the girls about their father beyond the simplest truth. He had chosen not to be there. She refused to teach them to hate a man they had never met. Occasionally, a glossy magazine would appear in the rack at the grocery store with Jason's face on the cover. She always looked away quickly, afraid that if she studied the picture too long, she would start imagining how different everything might have been. The headlines always praised him, the brilliant CEO who built an empire before 40, the man who never let personal distractions derail his vision. She wondered if she and the girls were the distractions those articles hinted at. She wondered if he ever regretted the price of his success. But she knew that wondering didn't change anything, so she tucked those thoughts into the quietest corner of her mind and refused to feed them. The girls were growing into themselves, each with her own secret world. Lily loved stories and would sit cross-legged for hours, paging through picture books, her brow furrowed in concentration. Cameron was the first to climb anything and the first to laugh when she fell. Bella was the one who always noticed when Ada was tired and climbed into her lap without a word, resting her head on her shoulder. Sometimes she told herself again and again that it was better to have that emptiness than to invite in the kind of coldness Jason had shown her. And yet some nights, when the lights were out and the apartment was quiet, she would close her eyes and admit to herself that she still missed the man she thought he could have been. But in the daylight, there was no time for regret. There was only breakfast to make, scraped knees to kiss, small hands to hold as they crossed the street. Ada chose to believe that all the tiny moments of care would be enough to fill the space Jason had left behind. She didn't expect to ever see him again. She certainly didn't expect that when she did, everything she thought she had accepted would come undone in a single heartbeat. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon when the shape of Ada's life shifted without warning. She had promised the girls a small treat after their doctor's appointment, so they stopped at the shopping center on the edge of town. The girls were giddy with anticipation, their little yellow dresses bright against the polished tile floor, as they pressed their hands to the glass case of the bakery, debating which cupcakes to choose. Ada stood just behind them, clutching her worn leather purse and smiling faintly at their chatter. She almost didn't notice the man stepping out of the elevator across the wide atrium. She almost didn't look up at all. But some instinct she couldn't name made her lift her head, and for a moment she thought her mind was playing a cruel trick. Jason stood there as if he had simply stepped out of her memory and into the present. He looked almost exactly as she remembered. Tall and composed, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes scanning the space with that familiar detached focus. The only thing that had changed was the faint strain in his expression, the tightness at the corners of his mouth that hadn't been there before. He was wearing a crisp blue suit, and he looked so polished, so impossibly out of place in this small-town shopping center that Ada felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs as she realized he was staring straight at her. It was too late to pretend she hadn't seen him, too late to turn away before recognition dawned in his eyes. His gaze dropped to the three little girls, lined up neatly in front of the display case, and she saw the exact moment he understood. His face went pale. His mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. Ada's first instinct was to gather her daughters and leave. She had practiced this moment in her mind so many times. She had always imagined that if he ever appeared, she would be able to walk away without hesitation. But now that he was here, flesh and blood and visibly shaken, she found herself unable to move at all. Her hands tightened around her purse strap. She felt a hot flush of anger rising under her skin, followed by something more dangerous. The ache of all the years she had spent wishing he would care enough to look for them. The girl sensed her stillness and turned to see what she was watching. Three pairs of blue eyes identical to Jason's lifted to meet his across the polished floor. Lily was the first to speak, her voice clear and curious. "Mama, who is that man?" Jason flinched at the word, as if it struck some place he wasn't prepared to feel. For an instant, Ada hated him for daring to look wounded, for letting that single syllable shake him when he had walked away without a backward glance. She swallowed hard, feeling her composure slip. She straightened her shoulders and laid a hand lightly on Lily's head, her voice steady even though her heart was beating so fast she thought she might faint. "He's someone—" She could see the question in them, the silent plea for her to confirm what he already knew. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away. She felt he finally found his voice, rough and unsteady. "Ada," he said, and her name sounded foreign on his tongue, like something precious he had never learned how to hold. "Are they—" She didn't want to give him the gift of that answer, but the girls were watching, waiting to see what she would say. So she nodded once, a tiny gesture that seemed to steal the strength from his legs. He reached for the back of the nearest bench as if he needed it to stay standing. No one spoke. The girls shifted restlessly, not understanding why the air had grown so heavy. Ada thought she had prepared herself for every possibility, but she had never imagined she would see tears in Jason's eyes. When they finally spilled over, she felt something break loose inside her, something she hadn't realized she was still holding on to. She didn't know whether to turn away or reach for him. So she did neither. She just stood there, her hand resting protectively on the head of the nearest child, while the man who had once sworn he didn't want to know her struggled to swallow the weight of what he had left behind. For a moment, it felt like the entire shopping center had gone silent around them. Though Ada could still hear the low murmur of people placing orders at the bakery counter and the faint music playing overhead, she watched Jason wipe his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture that was almost boyish in its uncertainty. She had never seen him look so stripped of certainty, so undone by anything. Part of her, she knew deep down, that this confrontation had been waiting for both of them since the day he closed the door on their life. He took a shaky breath and stepped closer, stopping just a few feet from her. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I didn't know," he said. "Ada, I swear to you, I didn't know." She felt her jaw tighten as the words settled between them. It was not an apology, not really. It was an explanation, an excuse dressed up as regret. Still, when she looked at his face, so pale and disbelieving, she felt something in her chest twist in a way she wished it wouldn't. "You didn't want to know," she said softly, and even now the memory of that night felt as vivid as if it had happened. "Yesterday. Oh, you told me not to exist." He looked down, his hands flexing helplessly at his sides. "I was wrong," he whispered. "God, I was so wrong. The girls shifted beside her, their curious eyes moving from her face to his. Bella reached for her hand and tugged gently. Mama, is he mad? Ada swallowed, forcing herself to smooth her daughter's hair. No, she said, though her voice shook. He's just surprised. Jason lifted his gaze to her again, and for the first time she saw no arrogance in it, no certainty that he was right, only devastation. Can I? His voice cracked and he pressed his lips together before trying again. Can I talk to you alone? Every instinct in her body told her to refuse. She didn't owe him an audience, not after all these years. But she also knew that there were things she would have to say eventually, words she had rehearsed in the dark when the girls were asleep. She looked at the children who were watching them both with wide, unblinking eyes. Girls, she said gently, would you like to pick out a treat? I'll be right here. They nodded and turned back to the glass display case, pressing their hands to the glass again. She waited until she was sure they were distracted before she faced Jason fully. Say what you came to say, she told him. He took another step forward, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her hand. But he stopped himself, dropping his arms back to his sides. I thought I was protecting my life, he said. I thought if I let you in, if I let any of it in, I'd lose everything I'd worked for. You did, she said, and her voice was quiet but steady. You lost us. He flinched as though she had struck him. I see that now, he said, his throat working as he swallowed. I see it every day. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ada. I don't even expect you to let me close. But I have to try. I can't just pretend they don't exist. That you don't. She didn't know how to answer that. Part of her wanted to scream that he had forfeited every right to this moment the day he turned away. But another part of her, smaller, sadder, older, recognized that the girls deserved the truth about where they came from. They deserved more than silence and bitterness. I'm not going to make this easy for you, she said at last. You don't get to walk in here and be a father because it suits you. They don't know you. They don't owe you anything. His shoulders sagged. I know, he said again, and she almost believed he did. I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm just asking you to let me be here, to let me try. Her throat felt tight as she looked at him standing there with tears still drying on his face. She wished she could hate him enough to refuse outright, but she had spent too long raising 3 little girls who carried his eyes to pretend that he didn't matter. Before she could answer, Lily called out, her voice bright and oblivious. Mama, can we have cupcakes? Ada turned away from Jason, forcing herself to smile at her daughter. Yes, she said, her voice gentler than she felt. Pick whichever ones you like. She didn't look at Jason again as she helped the girls choose their treats. But as she paid the cashier, she felt his presence behind her, patient and tentative, and she knew this was only the beginning of something they would all have to face. But when she turned to see that he was still standing there, waiting even after she paid for the cupcakes and gathered the girls around her, she felt an unfamiliar jolt of uncertainty. He wasn't walking away. He wasn't trying to reclaim something as if the past hadn't happened. He simply looked lost in a way she didn't know how to reconcile with the man she remembered. She took a steadying breath and shifted the paper bag of pastries in her arms. The girls circled her legs, glancing up at Jason with wide eyes that mirrored his own. I'm walking them home, she said, her voice flat because she didn't trust herself to let any softness in. If you want, but he nodded, swallowing hard, and fell into step beside her as she led the girls out of the shopping center into the bright afternoon. The street was busy with weekend shoppers and children carrying balloons, the air smelling of hot pavement and roasted coffee from the cafe on the corner. The girls chattered over each other about the cupcakes, who would get which one, whether they would save some for tomorrow. Ada clung to the ordinariness of their voices because it was the only thing keeping her steady. Beside her, I don't know how to begin, he said, his voice low, almost afraid. I thought about this moment so many times, and nothing I practiced in my head feels like enough. Ada kept her gaze on the sidewalk. Nothing you say will be enough, she said without malice. That doesn't mean you shouldn't say it anyway. He nodded slowly, his hands flexing at his sides. When I saw them, I knew. I knew I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I thought pushing you away would protect me from becoming someone I didn't know how to be. She stopped walking then because she couldn't pretend she wasn't listening. The girls ran a little ahead, chasing a scrap of paper that fluttered along the curb. She turned to face him fully. "Someone you didn't know how to be," she repeated softly. "A father." He flinched at the word, and she realized he had never said it aloud himself. He lifted his gaze to hers, and she saw the shame there, deeper than any pride he had once clung to. "Yes," he whispered. "I was afraid. And I thought if I let myself care, I'd fail at it. So I pretended it didn't matter. That you didn't matter." For a moment, she couldn't speak. She was back in that kitchen, her hand on her belly, hearing him say, "I don't want to know you." She felt again how small she had become in that instant. But she also felt something else, a tired, reluctant relief that he was finally saying it. "You were wrong," she said, her voice steady in a way she hadn't expected. "About all of it." He nodded once. "I know." His gaze flicked to the girls as they circled back toward them, giggling over their found scrap of paper. "I can't ask you to forgive me," he said. "I'm not here to demand anything. I just want—" She felt the ache of everything they had lost, but for the first time she also felt a fragile thread of something else, something almost like hope. She turned back to him and said the only thing she could manage. And then, together, without another word, they walked the rest of the way down the narrow street. When they reached her building, the girls dashed up the steps, arguing over who would hold the door. Ada paused before following them inside. She looked back at Jason and met his eyes, seeing for the first time that he looked just as scared as she was. "One day doesn't fix anything," she said quietly. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. But I have to start somewhere." She nodded, then turned and went into the building without looking back. And though nothing had been decided, though nothing was healed, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the start of something she had thought was gone forever, a beginning. Jason came back the next morning because he didn't know what else to do. He had spent the night in a hotel room that felt too big and too sterile, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the image of Ada, standing there with their daughters beside her, with the version of his life he had always insisted was complete. He hadn't slept more than a few hours, and when dawn came, he found himself standing on the sidewalk outside her building, hands buried in his coat pockets, wondering if she would even open the door. When she did, she looked wary, but not surprised, as though part of her had known he wouldn't be able to stay away. The girls crowded behind her, still in their pajamas, their hair sticking up in soft, golden tangles. They peered around her legs at him, wide-eyed and solemn, and something in his chest clenched so hard he almost had to look away. Ada didn't invite him in at first. She stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, as if she needed to hold herself steady. He couldn't blame her. He had been the one to strip away any foundation they might have built together, and it would have been easier for her to slam the door and pretend she had never seen him again. He would have deserved it. But instead, she took a long breath, and after a moment she stepped back just enough to let him cross the threshold. He moved slowly, careful not to make assumptions about where he belonged. The apartment was small, warm with the smells of coffee and the faint sweetness of syrup. There were 3 little backpacks, lined up neatly by the door, each with a name stitched in bright thread. He read them one by one, Lily, Cameron, Bella, and felt another crack open in the shell he'd spent years building around his heart. The girls watched him with silent fascination as he took off his coat and knelt so he was closer to their height. He didn't reach for them. He wasn't sure he had the right. He simply looked at each of them in turn, memorizing every detail he had missed. Lily was the first to speak, her voice soft but certain. "Are you coming back tomorrow too?" she asked, as though this was the most natural question in the world. Jason swallowed hard and nodded. "If your mom says it's okay," he managed. Ada didn't answer right away. She moved past them to the kitchen, her shoulders tense, and he knew she was listening to every word. He followed slowly, stopping in the doorway as she filled 3 cups with juice. She didn't look up, but her voice was calm when she finally spoke. "They don't know how to feel about you yet," she said, "and I don't either." "I don't expect you to," he said quietly. "I'm not here because I want to feel better about myself. I'm here because they're my daughters, and because I can't pretend they aren't anymore." For a long moment, she just stood there, her hand resting on the counter. Then she turned to face him, her eyes tired but clear. "If you mean that, you'll have to show them. Not just today, not just when it's convenient." "I know," he said. "I'm ready." "Are you?" she asked, her gaze searching his face for any sign of the man who had walked away. He didn't look away. "Yes," he whispered, because it was the only truth he had left. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, a tiny motion that felt like a door unlocking. She called to the girls, and they came running, jostling for places at the small table. He helped them. When breakfast was over, Lily slipped her hand into his without hesitation, and Cameron climbed into his lap with a shy smile. Bella hovered near Ada's knee, studying him with cautious eyes. He knew Ada didn't say much as she cleared the table, but when she passed him with an empty plate, she paused just long enough to meet his gaze. "You can come back tomorrow," she said, her voice very quiet. He nodded, unable to find any words that felt big enough. Later, when he left, he turned on the sidewalk and saw all three girls pressed against the window watching him go. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Because even if nothing else was certain, he knew he would be back. Jason returned every morning for the next week. He came before the girls were dressed and stayed until their bedtime stories were finished. He didn't come with expensive gifts or grand gestures, because he knew that nothing he bought could fill the years he'd missed. Instead, he learned the smallest details of their days. He learned each morning he sat cross-legged on the floor and let them hand him dolls and crayons and scraps of construction paper until the edges of his immaculate suit were smudged with glue and fingerprints. He did not care. She never told the girls he shouldn't be there. But she didn't soften either, not at first. She was polite, quiet, her voice steady even when her eyes looked exhausted. Sometimes she would ask about his work in the careful tone of a woman trying to keep her distance. Other times she said nothing at all. He never pushed. He knew he was only beginning to prove he could be different. One evening, after the girls had insisted he read 3 books in a row, he set down the last one and looked around the living room. The walls were covered in their drawings and photos of birthdays he hadn't been there to see. He thought of all the nights she must have sat in this same chair, rocking a feverish child or soothing nightmares with no one to turn to. The guilt pressed so hard into his chest, he almost couldn't breathe. Ada walked past him on her way to the kitchen, and he couldn't stop himself from speaking. "You were right to leave," he said, his voice rough. She paused but didn't turn around. He swallowed hard, staring down at his hands. "You did." When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were shining. "I didn't want to do it alone," she said quietly. "I just didn't have a choice." He felt something fracture in his chest. He stood and walked to where she stood by the counter. He didn't try to touch her. He only met her gaze and let her see all the regret he carried. "I'm here now," he said. Not because Finally she nodded, as if she had come to some private conclusion. "Then be here," she said, "and don't make them pay for your doubt again." "I won't," he said without hesitation. When he left that night, the girls were already asleep. He paused at their door, studying the 3 small shapes curled under matching blankets. In the dim, but he also knew he would never stop trying to become the kind of father they deserved. On the landing, Ada came to stand beside him. For the first time, she didn't keep her distance. She rested her hand lightly on the doorframe. "You can," she nodded once, and though she didn't smile, something in her expression had finally shifted. He understood that trust wouldn't come all at once, that forgiveness might never come fully. But he also understood that this was the first moment they had both stood on the same side of the past. And that was enough to keep him going. As he stepped into the night air, he felt the smallest thread of hope winding through all the regret and longing, something fragile but undeniable. He would be back at dawn and the day after and the day after that, for as long as it took to show all of them that he was never going to disappear again. I think it's honest about how much harm Jason caused by abandoning Ada and the girls, and it never tries to make his regret into something heroic. What makes the ending meaningful is that he doesn't expect forgiveness as a reward for returning. He knows he has to earn trust with small, consistent actions over time. I appreciate that Ada doesn't rush to forgive him. Her guarded acceptance feels real, She allows him near, but sets clear boundaries to protect her children and herself. It ends with an understanding. Rebuilding trust is slow and sometimes painful, but it can begin if you have the humility to admit you were wrong. In the end, this isn't about a man redeeming himself with one grand gesture. It's about a man who finally chooses to stay, to be present, and to take responsibility. That's a quieter kind of redemption, and one that feels much more true.